Alright class, welcome back. Yes, I know, here's another video. This is the third installment, but I'm going to change it up a little bit. I've noticed some of you have been having trouble watching it, interacting with it, so I'm going to ask you to do a couple things, and please try to follow them through. One thing you are going to do is I'm going to say, write this down in your notes, and then after you type it out or write it down, at the end you'll take a picture of it or a screenshot and then submit it to your assignments. So that way, that will be your check that I know you've watched it and you've gone through everything and you've written down all the stuff I've said to. Also, to help you remember a few things, I might ask you to jump up and down, act some stuff out. That's okay. I can't really see if you're doing it or not, but if you do, it will help you. So let's start off right here. We've talked about Pennsylvania and William Penn and the founding of Pennsylvania, but something interesting was Pennsylvania, when it was founded in 1682, was called the City of Brotherly Love. Now, that's not just because they were really nice to each other, but they actually wanted to make sure that their entire religion was around having fair dealings with people and taking care of people around them and not being aggressive. So they were free to worship, they protected individuals' rights, and the colony thrived by growing their own food crops. So they were able to be self-sufficient. So what you need to write down is Holy Experiment, and then put a little sign and say City of Brotherly Love, to help you understand that the Holy Experiment was Philadelphia taking care of everyone around them. Now, let's talk about ethnicity a little bit. In the middle colonies, there was a diverse middle class, and some of these groups also included Scandinavians, Dutch, and Germans. So you got to realize is these are people from all different countries coming in. And later you also had groups of Scottish and Irish immigrants coming in as well. One of the things that attracted them was the religious freedom and the economic opportunities. They were looking for jobs and religious freedom. So this one, you've really got to think of, it wasn't just groups of people from England. When we think of Europeans, it's Scandinavians, Dutch, German, all of those groups together coming over. Let's talk about some of the conflicts between the Native Americans and settlers. The settlers considered the Indians heathens. They also didn't understand the Indians' government, the way that it functioned, and that was also due in part to the Indians had different governments for each of their own sections. So different tribes would have different governments. They all had different attitudes regarding work, what work entailed. Indians, often they weren't concerned with having material wealth. They didn't want a big house or a big cart and lots of horses, and they weren't worried about the material things that other people would look at and say, oh, well, you only have one hammer? Well, I've got 5 hammers. I'm just trying to give you an example. They wouldn't have talked about their iPhones because they didn't have them back then. Another thing was the impact of the environment. The settlers were encroaching on the Native Americans' land, thus making it harder for the Native Americans to hunt. I don't know if any of you have been hunting before. If you've been hunting, one thing is if you're sitting there and you've got your gun out and you're watching the deer go by and then someone else comes tromping through the woods, obviously you're going to get mad at that person. They've interfered with it. Now imagine your whole life is being interfered. Another thing is their concept of warfare, ownership. There were a lot of different things. So the Indians didn't understand the European battle tactics. They didn't just stand there and shoot each other. The Indians, instead, they would retreat when confronted by a bigger force and then attack from the side. What we call guerrilla warfare, a lot came from their ways of fighting. Now let's talk about the cultural interactions. We have the Columbian Exchange, and this Columbian Exchange was where not only goods and diseases were exchanged, but also ideas between them. And not been for the assistance of the Indians in helping the colonists, the agriculture and the settling of Jamestown, the colonists wouldn't have made it. So it wasn't just a one-way exchange where the Europeans were teaching things to the Native Americans. We have to look at the colonists and the Indians. They adopted these technologies of planting. You could think of another technology would be fish in the ground. So what I want you to do is write down cultural interactions. I want you to write diseases and fish next to plants. I want you to draw a little picture of a fish next to a plant. That's going to be your note for cultural interactions. Headright system. Talk about that for a little bit. It was a way of distributing land. So we got to think there had to be a way of giving certain people certain amounts of land. Land that was available to those who could cultivate it. There was plenty to be had, but it needed to be taken care of. So let's talk about the head, or when they say head, they mean settler, each person. Each settler coming in to live in the colony, they had a right to 50 acres of unoccupied land, given on the condition that the settlers had to plant a crop and build some sort of shelter there. This system, well, it was used uh, in Pennsylvania, Maryland, and the southern colonies. So I want you to write that down. Pennsylvania, Maryland, southern colonies, head right system. In those colonies, if you planted something and built a house, you got to live there, basically for free. Later on, though, then we learned that people started upping the taxes. Indentured servants. I do have a couple of servants or slaves that are going to take that position in their colony. So here's the thing. This brought them to the colonies. If you didn't have enough money, you could pay somebody by giving them years of your servant, or years of being a servant to them. You are bonded for usually 5 years. That's important. I want you to write indentured servitude or indentured servants, average of 5 years. You would promise, I will work for you for free for 5 years, as long as you would receive the right to travel to the colonies, and that's it. You would also get a place to sleep and to live, but often that could just be an open shelter with a roof. They were very strict. They controlled you, and at the end of it, though, you became free. So you did earn your freedom. You weren't a permanent slave. But they found that this was problematic because once you had finished being a servant, you wanted to make extra money, and you weren't always willing to work for the same farmer. So slave labor came in. The first slaves arrived in Jamestown in 1619. They became very common in most of the colonies by 1640. Slaves were being bought, sold, and were a great labor force as far as investments. They were considered chattel property or property. They weren't a person. We'll talk about that a little more in the classroom, what it means to be a person versus property. Now this is where slavery comes in. If you look right here, you see this triangle that flows around. So you have the New World, Europe, Africa, and back. So slaves were taken to America and traded for raw materials. Raw materials were taken over to Europe and fashioned into trade goods, and those trade goods often went back to Africa in exchange for slaves, back and forth. This also spread disease all across the world. Now let's talk about slavery in the North and then slavery in the South. So slavery was more common in the southern colonies because of the plantations. The northern colonies relied less on agriculture, so you needed someone who was specialized, a specialized job. You didn't want to just bring someone over. Now, slavery declined in the North and remained really strong in the South, and we can see this grows and grows until our country becomes separated into the Civil War years later. So the northern slaves tended to have more rights, and the northerners still considered, but they still considered the slaves or the black people inferior. So let's say you weren't a slave up there, but if you were a different race, you were inferior, you weren't as smart, you didn't have the same rights. I can answer some questions about that later in the classroom. The Stono Rebellion. This is the first known slave rebellion. So I want you to write that down. Write Stono Rebellion and put First Slave Rebellion on your notes. You're going to turn that in as well. The slaves believed the masters had been weakened by disease. The rebellion was crushed eventually, and 44 slaves were killed. Because of this, though, they said, you know what? We need slave codes. We need laws and rules to regulate the slaves, make sure they don't ever rise up, make sure that they're controlled, and if one slave gets out of hand, then we have to know what we can do to put them back in their place. These slave codes were horrible, by the way, and we'll do some more research into that on your own. But let's talk about just the colonial life in the South. It was difficult. Only the wealthiest planters were able to have enough slaves that they didn't have to work. But everyone else was manual labor, 12, 14 hours a day, solid work. They had rudimentary houses. They had very little furniture. Schooling did not exist. They couldn't even go to public school because there were no schools. You lived in isolation, so you didn't see other people very often. If someone lived within 5 miles or 4 miles of you, that was usually pretty close. But imagine walking 5 miles to visit with your friend in the evening after you've worked for 14 hours and then walking home, sleep for a couple hours, get up and work the next day. It wasn't possible. They couldn't travel. So at the same time, they had little influence from the infrastructure of the church around there. But many of the farmers were able to thrive and make a great living off of this type. They were able to grow. Another thing is, the more children you had, they ate more food, but they worked more. So a lot of the families would develop into larger families. All right, let's talk about Georgia. Yeah, we're getting close to the end of this one. I'm going to stop here in a little bit, but I've got 2 more slides I want to go through for sure. Oglethorpe. Oglethorpe created Georgia as a debtor's colony. At this time, if you owed someone money, they could actually send you to jail. So I want you to write down Georgia and then Oglethorpe on there. Imagine you borrow money from someone, and then rather than paying them back, you say, look, I don't have the money this month. They would take you and arrest you and throw you in jail. And we'll go into that. You can look up debtor's prison if you want and find some more research on that. So the hopes dim that the colony could produce olive oil, silk, and wine. There were things that they wanted to produce goods to make money. And they had about 50,000 what they called undesirables that were being shipped there. And in 1752, Georgia became a royal colony. Now, we talked about that. It wasn't able to support itself. So the crown, the royalty, stepped in to take charge of it. So proprietors tended to move out because there were certain people, we had talked about a proprietor being in charge, they'd get paid some, but they kept the colony alive. And in this instance, the proprietors weren't doing their job. So with the departure of them, the inland area of the colony became open to settlement. However, early settlement in these areas was really difficult because there were hostile Native Americans and harsh living conditions. So if you're from Georgia and that's your colony that you're working on, you need to write down hostile Indians and harsh living conditions. Those were hard things there. But there were a lot of people that moved there. So by 1770, I think about that, 1776 is the American Revolution. By 1770, there were more than 250,000 people that lived in this, what they called the back country. Peter Zenger. Zenger published controversial statements about New York's governor. Now, one of you is going to be New York's governor as well, so you may want to partner up with this. One of the most important legal cases in colonial America was the New York printer John Peter Zenger. Zenger, the editor of the New York Weekly Journal, had been hired by opponents of colonial governor William Cosby when the New York Colony Supreme Court denied Cosby's claim that he was owed back salary, that someone owed him money. The governor fired the Chief of Justice. Zenger's paper responded with stinging attacks against Cosby and his supporters. So what happened is 2 months after this, Cosby had the journal shut down and also had Zenger arrested and charged with seditious libel, or basically bad talking about them. So Zenger had attacked him by publishing this in the newspaper. And Zenger was potentially guilty of a criminal offense against the government because he had published it. Does anyone notice newspaper? That goes into what we have our Constitution. We'll talk about next month, really. But think about how it began here. This is one of those places where it started freedom of the press. So I want you to write that down. Trial of Peter Zenger, and write down freedom of the press on there. Because this right here, accused of seditious libel. Imagine once something was printed and then the government could just say, you know what, we don't like it. We're going to throw you in jail and shut down your newspaper. So, lost that. There we go. After 2 months, Cosby had it shut down. Here we go. Zenger's lawyer, Andrew Hamilton, developed a novel defense against the charge. He argued that Zenger was not guilty of seditious libel since the charges he made against Cosby were in fact true. The jury agreed that Hamilton's argument was a valid argument and found that Zinger was not guilty. The case did not entirely eliminate seditious libel laws, but it did cut down on their usage. So this case, they were able to prove in court that if you print it in the newspaper and it's true, then it's not necessarily you saying something bad about them and slandering their name. Well, that's all it for today. So do me a favor and take all of your notes. If they're in a Google document, just turn them into this assignment. If they're by hand, take a picture of them, submit them. I'll look over them, and we'll have some more discussions on this tomorrow in class. Thanks, and have a great day.